Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this afternoon to grow, to learn, to be inspired by one of the most insightful thinkers I have ever come across with regards to American politics, with regards to race, with regards to education, her specific area of specialty, but perhaps most importantly, with regards to empowering our Latino communities in the United States and across all the states, in many ways, in the United States, from the perspective of a New Yorker, which is a bit unique and interesting itself. Dr. Lisette Nieves is a native New Yorker. She is of Puerto Rican descent. She was born in New York and was educated in the public schools of New York and graduated from the City University of New York in 19 and that's because I don't want to reveal her age. I'm supposed to laugh. Come on, lighten up. And then won a Rhodes Scholarship, which is perhaps the most prestigious award that a college student can win to go study at Oxford for a year or two. 2 years, generally, right? 2 years. So, and at Oxford, met her husband. And they've been together ever since, have a beautiful son, who's now 17, Gabriel,
Yes.
who I first knew when he was 6 or 7 years old. My wife and I, Charlene, hi Charlene, knew when he was 6 or 7 years old. She subsequently came back and enrolled at what was called then the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Now the Wilson name has been dropped because of the way in which Woodrow Wilson, President Woodrow Wilson, professor at Princeton, professor of politics at Princeton, president of Princeton, governor of the state of New Jersey, and then president of the United States, because of the hardcore segregationist policies and pronouncements that characterized his entire professional life. Now it's called, I guess, the Princeton School of something.
Public and International Affairs, yeah.
Public and International Affairs. And from there, began a career in a variety of nonprofit institutions, nonprofit work, nonprofit organizations have always been the focus of her professional work. And a variety of sorts, in a variety of ways. We first met when we were both appointed by President Obama to his advisory commission on educational excellence for Hispanics, as some of you know. And I'm sitting there waiting to take the oath of office in the Red Castle building of the Smithsonian Institution. Some of you have heard this already, so forgive me. And all of a sudden this person comes and sits, as I recall, to my left.
Yes.
And starts a conversation with me. And I thought, first, like, who is this person? And I said, wow, this is going to be so much fun because she's brilliant and has a lot of insight to offer and has that New Yorker energy that is just intoxicating and pushes everybody to work harder, to work better, to work smarter than they do. And we had a marvelous time. We're on the phone with each other pretty often. And we co-chaired the post-secondary educational subcommittee for that commission, and we're the only ones who actually did some work that went to the White House, where it died, where it wasn't used because it was in the middle of a re-election campaign and all this kind of stuff. Since that time.
Well, it was used by other higher ed institutions.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Good. Tell me which ones. She then enrolled to get a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, from their Graduate School of Education. I'm going to guess blew through that program and did extremely well. And that resulted in the publication of her first book, and the title is, forgive me, Lisette.
Working to learn.
Working to Learn.
Creating multiple pathways for young people.
Which in part was based on one of the nonprofits that she helped organize, Year Up, which was an organization that is designed to help students who are not immediately college bound to get experience to be able to enhance their capacity to earn.
That's right.
And their capacity to become professionalized. And so we were a wonderful complement as we worked on post-secondary education, I think, at that time. Now, she is the president of the Fund for the City of New York that has a budget of $250 million that provides funding and technical assistance and other things to cities and states and organizations there to be able to serve largely, I would say, the underserved.
Absolutely, make cities better. Yeah,
and
quality
works,
of life.
yeah, works toward trying to improve their quality of life. She also serves on President Biden's, the board of the
Corporation for National Service.
Corporation for National Service.
AmeriCorps.
Yeah, AmeriCorps. She serves on the board with how many other people?
About 12.
Yeah.
Still going through confirmation.
So you can see how these things interact. Last thing I'll say, and then I'll ask her to say a few introductory remarks. She is one of the most brilliant and inspiring people I've ever met. She can talk about many, many different things, as can her husband, Greg, who's dear. And she brings that insight from a part of her life and a part, as you'll hear, of her soul that few people are willing to do. As a working class person herself, as a family that has struggled, as many of our families do, she speaks with the power of someone who not only knows about the challenges that these communities have, lower income communities generally, but has lived many of them and uses that to be able to bring together insight that I know is helping the city of New York move forward. And one day, when she's Secretary of Education, she's going to let me ride her coattails, and I'll be special advisor for
whatever you want.
For nothing that's very important. Because I want to work very hard. She'll have other people who do that. But I remember telling you that early on at the time we got to know each other. So, without any further ado, since I've taken up almost all of her time, please help me in giving a great Irish welcome to Dr. Lisette Nieves. Our format today is that I'm going to ask her a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So when we open it up to the audience, if you want your image recorded in perpetuity, stand up and look at the camera right there. And if you don't, just stand up and speak over here, because we'll get your words, and you'll be able to tell us what you want to tell us. So, let me begin. Lisette, tell us about your family background. You've got a very interesting family background that you shared with our class this morning.
Sure. I always say I am born and raised in New York via Puerto Rico, and that's because the Puerto Rican identity is so, compared to many other Latino groups, you could be third, fourth, fifth generation on the mainland here and still identify as Puerto Rican. So I say that because that's an important part of this kind of energy and dynamism to identity politics that's very Puerto Rican. Even if you haven't been to the island, people feel really strong about saying that. But New York, my parents came here during the Great Wave of migration in the 40s, when it's the largest you probably learned this all through Dr. Fraga already, the largest air migration that's ever happened to the U.S. with Puerto Ricans, well over 1 million. Think about it at that time, right? And so my family came over in military planes, and they would strap them across 8 in a row, right? Just think about that. This was all to have labor that would fuel the manufacturing companies in New York. So they came over to do that kind of work. And the idea was pulling people out of the rural parts of Puerto Rico to the cities of Puerto Rico, and then ultimately to New York, and it was called Operation Bootstrap. So my family came through Operation Bootstrap. And my grandmother, till she passed away, would talk about how she had lined up all 6, at that time, of children herself, could you imagine? And of course, her mother, right? Her mother-in-law in this case. And I always think of that image because that was, what is that like? Like you think with all your kids, and I will say this, and my grandfather, on one side was already in the military. Puerto Ricans had historically served in the military. So I say that because this is interesting dynamic of what was, and many of the men came over first, and then the rest of the family would come over. Sound familiar to some folks, right? But that was the story. But born and raised in New York, which meant I was also first generation high school graduate on one side, and first generation college grad on both sides. And I would say one thing that you talked about, and understanding that there was early in my upbringing some challenges, but I would say we are not one single narrative, right? That there was also an enormous amount of resiliency and moxie and things like that. So I'll give an example. My grandmother comes over. My grandfather was disabled. He had been, there was a truck that ran him over in one of the sugarcane farms in Aguadilla, Puerto Rico. And so he couldn't walk, he lost a leg. And the story goes in our family that my grandmother went to the company and said, you better pay for this. And that's how they were able to get their fares to come to the US, right? That's tough. That just tells you one thing about my grandmother, right? But she opened the cuchifrito place, which was just a little Spanish food place in Brooklyn. Now there's someone who didn't know the language, didn't know all the paperwork, but found ways of doing it. And I always think about that. I think about that kind of, and my grandfather, even though when I say he was disabled, he worked in a factory. And he would talk about how he would wrap his hands in discarded cloth because they didn't give you the gloves to pull stuff out, right? I mean, you got to think about this is factory work back then, right? And so I think about that. So that's part of my story too, but that's a bit about that. And my parents grew up and went to the schools in the New York City system. And I'll end on this before we get to another question. When we think about that at the time, in the 50s and 60s in New York, at least half of Puerto Rican students were in special education. They were not seeing English as a second language didn't exist. Bilingual education didn't exist. We have to thank Dr. Pantoja for that, who brought that on later. But to understand that you had a 1 in 2 chance if you went to school of being in special ed, which meant you probably weren't going to graduate, or mainstreamed, but not necessarily really incorporated. And so I was probably the first generation that benefited from any of the civil rights reforms that took place. And so I went to school in the 70s, and that's when all of these ed reforms happened for Puerto Ricans, and subsequently radically changed the path for Puerto Ricans. But the generation before me was a very different experience. People would say, well, they've been here for 20 years. Shouldn't that have been easier? It's like, not when you had a 1 in 2 chance of being in special ed.
Because of language.
Because of language.
Just because of language.
Just because of language. Just because of language. Mm-hmm. And just because of the language of what does it mean to other someone at different times. We have other people who were not of the same language other times historically, but didn't necessarily put them in special ed. This had a double layer to it. And so it's a fascinating moment.
Lisa, why did you decide to go to CUNY, Brooklyn College?
You know that story.
Yes. It's a very interesting story.
Well, I didn't at first decide to go to the City University. I knew my family was like, go to college. Any college will do. Do we know that, right? It's like, you want any college will do. Please, just get a degree, right? And because, you know, I understood that. I understood what was clear is that, as your research has shown us many, many times, the assumptions that if we're not going in huge numbers means our families are not interested is bogus. Our families have a huge commitment to education, even if, in fact, I'd say even more if they did not go, right? Like in some ways it was like, you need to go. And so what happened in my situation was that I did not want to go to school to, I knew I was going to go to college, but I didn't want to go to school where I have a lot of debt. It made me very stressed and anxious, this idea of me being on the debit category of my family's finances versus on the credit category. I raise my child now, and if you were to ask my son today, what is the cost of a gallon of milk, he would probably not know right now. He'd be embarrassed about saying that. I knew what a quart cost. I knew what a gallon cost. I knew what the groceries were for. I'm just giving an example of how finance was so central to my upbringing and understanding that. Anybody else have that experience? Right? And so for me, I went into something called a City Volunteer Corps, and I decided to give a year of service, and you could get a scholarship that would pay for 4 years of public education. And so that was the route I took. It was the predecessor to AmeriCorps. And I worked on a variety of different issues, AIDS most importantly. And then I said I was going to go to college. I got into some of these very fancy names like Notre Dame, some really great names. And just financially, what I learned through the process is I didn't want to be the student who would be working all the time and be stressed and not get the degree, right? I even had that sense of what working class shape would look like in another environment, you know. I mean, I think I would think of it differently now. I didn't have as many people who could have helped me navigate or translate that. And so I went to Brooklyn College. I was online, late registration. Yes, I was, in the gym with 400 other people. That was the way that it was done. You waited online. You hoped to, should I say it? Yes, flirt with someone so you could get ahead, go on and try to get that class that someone else couldn't get. All of a sudden you became best friends with someone who was on the other, you know. But the idea is that I went to Brooklyn College, and they have a very strong liberal arts curriculum. And I was fortunate that I had a professor there, Professor Williams in history, who said to me, I think you're pretty special. And I think about that moment. I still do, even at this age. I think you're pretty special, and you could do what you need to do here, right? And I just never forgot that, because I had so many people tell me that if I turned down these other schools, that I would be, you know, all my dreams would be gone. And that wasn't the case. So I was able to take advantage of that.
Who advised you, or did you do it largely on your own, to apply for a Rhodes?
So it actually started when I was walking down the hallway at Brooklyn College, and it was on the walls. There's a lot that's on the walls. Do you notice that? And sometimes I learned to read that too. One thing my family did teach me, and that's why I love this notion of not believing a single narrative. One thing my parents always said is, we may not know, but someone knows. Find the someone who knows, right? So this idea, and I'm actually really proud that they were not, I didn't have this gendered upbringing where I couldn't ask questions. Maybe not with them, with other people, you know. But I mean, so it was look around you, you're going to be resourceful. I kind of knew early on I had to create my own path. Right? I just knew. And so I saw something for the Truman Scholarship, and I said, but I already have done all this public service. Well, I'm going to do that. And I went to one of my professors and said, could you write a recommendation? And they said, yeah. And they said to me, no one has ever won. No one will ever win these things, whatever. And I was like, let them tell me no. Just write your recommendation and make sure it's more than one paragraph. I learned that from someone. I don't even know who to. They write your recommendation, just can't be one paragraph.
Very good advice.
No, it's actually, I have sat on Rhodes and Truman committees and everything now, and I say, wow, I'm glad someone said that, like, you have to really, right? So, I won the Truman, and everybody was shocked. I wasn't shocked, I don't know why, I was like, this makes sense. And then I knew I could go anywhere. because I had the money that I could go to any of those schools I didn't go to before. And then I had to sit down. I sat with another Professor Wilson, and I said to him, he's in political science, brilliant political scientist, and I said, I could leave. And he says, you could? Well, look at how much more you could do here. And that's when I doubled down on Brooklyn College, because it happened in my sophomore year. And the head of the Truman Foundation was somebody who I probably wouldn't have met before. Grew up in the South, probably was a segregationist, right?
He was.
Oh, he was, hardcore, right?
I remember him.
Absolutely. And worked on the Goldwater campaign. Oh, so that's all I gotta say. But he had worked in, I think, covert ops. I don't know, I'm not supposed to say that. I don't know. Worked in a variety of roles for the government.
That's true.
Yes, and there's just a time in history where certain professionals that had science degree, right? There's just, for some of us, kind of know that part. Anyway, he said to me, you and I are going to disagree on a lot of things in life. He says, but I don't scare you, and you don't scare me. I never forgot that. And I said, and I joked with him, and I said, because I haven't convinced you yet that you have the wrong ideas in life. He thought that was funny. And he said, but we understood each other. And I think some of it was this idea of, irrespective of where you are politically on the spectrum, if you could get in touch with people who understand that their trajectories were not just because of them, that other people really helped them, right? You get a different conversation. And when I really understood his upbringing and what it meant for a poor Southerner to get an advanced engineering degree, there was a piece where we connected. And I never forgot that. And so he called me up and said, you need to get one of these Rhodes Scholarships. So yes, a staunch prior segregationist from the South asked me to apply. And I said, do women get, I remember only men got them. I said, and he goes, I'm going to write you a recommendation. You just get the other 7. And when I went to my school, think about expectations, I said, I'm going to apply for the Rhodes Scholarship. And they said, no, you're not. You need a school endorsement. I said, I'm already an A student, I don't understand, what do you mean? I said, I don't need a school endorsement, because see, someone told me earlier too, no is one step closer to yes. It's an interesting one, right? And so, and I said, well, I said, I can get an outside sponsor. I said, the head of the Truman Foundation wants me to apply and is already doing the recommendation. Should I tell him no? See how that works? Sometimes you get people, you just got to use people to have, sometimes carry your battles for you. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, okay. And once again, Lisette, you're not going to get it. Don't set your expectations up. And I felt like I had nothing to lose anyway. Right? I mean, this is the thing. It's like, oh, there are people who walk around in the world assuming they're getting things. Like, that blew me away. I was not raised with that kind of entitlement. I did not assume that I would get it. So the fact that I had all these people reminding me that I couldn't get it blew me away, that people grew up only believing they could get everything they wanted. That shocked me. So they thought that was going to scare me? Well, I don't know if I'm going to get it either. So guess what? We applied. So I applied, and then I got it. And I will tell you, the response was crazy. There was a lot of people who were happy, and there were some people who were very angry. I wasn't supposed to be the first.
You were the first Puerto Rican.
First Puerto Rican woman to get the Rhodes Scholarship at the City University as well. And I think the thing was that I wasn't the honors student, though I had always done well. Honors classes were always during the time I was working. So I actually took classes at night as well, right? In my schedule, I made it work for me to accommodate work. And I think they were just surprised that I was the first. more champions than critics, but some of the critics were a bit scathing.
Could you give us one example?
Sure, a scathing one. I got a note from the president's office, who was very proud, because they were happy. Schools are happy to highlight anyone who gets recognition, and that's fine. I was happy to do that. I went to the president's office and said, oh, there's this letter for you. And I would get letters, and they'd be usually from older people who would drop off $5 in an envelope for me to say for your school books. You know, things like really sweet. All of a sudden, this city of multiple millions of people felt like a neighborhood. Everybody was rooting for me, right? It was really lovely. The mayor, I mean, it was one of those moments where you felt embraced by your city. Because New York knows how to act like you don't exist, but then when it decides you exist, it really knows you exist. It really hugs you. You know, it's like a big hug, you know? And so the letter I opened said, how dare you be so inarticulate and take the award away from a more deserving student, right? And I read it, and I was in the president's secretary at the time was shocked. She couldn't believe that I would get this note. Like, she was shocked. And I'm reading it, and I was like, okay, what student would write that? And I said, it could have been a faculty member who wrote that. What makes you think it was just a student? And that shocked her twice. And then I realized, wow, we're in these bubbles. Like, people don't think that was the first time I've heard something like that. People think that's the first time I hadn't heard someone question my intellect, right? I'd done well before, long before this, and people would be like, did you study? Which means if I got an A and I didn't study, you're saying I cheated, right? Like, that's the flip side. So I've learned what these things mean. But then I realized there's a whole group of people who never believe that this happens. So, you know, I went home and I told my mother, and my mother got angry, and my father was like, yeah, only one? Ah, you're doing fine, you know? So I just say that because I think we can't expect that when opportunity that is given to someone that they're not used to seeing opportunity given to, we've created a political narrative that means the opportunity is being taken away from someone else, right? And that narrative is so strong because it reinforces shame. It makes us start doubting ourselves and believing that crap. And it's crap because it's not true. I did not take the opportunity away from someone else. I am grateful and deserving at the same time. And we can all be grateful and deserving. So there you go.
Thank you for sharing that story with us. Tell us about how you came up with the idea of Europe. And maybe one of the major challenges you faced in establishing Europe.
Okay, great. So Europe had existed in Boston. The idea was that it was a year up in a young person's life. These are young people who are not in school and not working between the ages of 18 and 24. I had funded workforce development while I was the chief of staff for youth services in the city under Mayor Bloomberg. And I will tell you, what I noticed is that we would pay people to train people and work, but then we wouldn't hold them accountable for if they got a job. And I was a real pragmatist at the time. I was like, if I'm paying you to do this, then what's the outcome? To me, it was a natural question. That was not the question at the time. It was not the question for higher ed either, right? Get in all these young people. Doesn't matter if they graduate or not. You're not going to be held accountable for that, right? But I thought it all made sense because I was raised with, if you do this, I expect that. So I just assumed the rest of the world had, if you do this, I expect that. That wasn't the case. So I was feeling like even this community of incredibly well-intentioned nonprofits were not thinking about the future of work in the way that I could see the future of work. And were thinking about jobs that weren't necessarily paying meaningful wages, right? So I have a philosophy that young people are constantly understanding themselves, making sense of themselves, evaluating themselves, and their sense of their college and work identity may not always happen at the same time, but that we have to keep both in their lives, right? And so that if we can expose them to things, they could reimagine what's next for them. And so what happened then was they reached out to me and said, well, could you start Year Up in New York. And these were wealthy business guys in Boston. That's the best way of thinking about it. At that time, this was anybody who was a finance person, finance something, right? I mean, it was an interesting time. It was big ed reform time. And I said, I will do it only if I control the shots. Because what I had learned at that point was that I am not a good figurehead. I need to really believe and buy into the mission versus feel like someone else is running it behind me. And that's why everybody has different roles on how they see themselves and things like that. And so every opportunity I've had has been negotiated from that stance. People may not understand it. For me, is where is my latitude to make an impact? So with Year Up, I said, if you will give me the anchor money without strings, it was a $250,000 grant, I will work my butt off and we'll do this. And 5 years later, 26 Wall Street firms, a few thousand young people, $6 million budget, and I'm really proud. It was one of the best things I did in my life, and I will say one of the successful things that I think is important is one is I realize even more, and your group has heard me say this, that your best work is done through others. It was a true team effort. You can't build something without a group of people who believe in it deeply. And then the second thing is, when you have a young person who has always lived a life of scarcity, get to a point where scarcity is not a priority, you unleash a level of creativity and freedom that is a blessing. And then you get to see talent just explore, and you expand the degrees of freedom that someone may feel about their lives. And so for me, that was wonderful because Year Up was important in my life because my dad was probably one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. Never graduated high school, always read, wrote me my first email. Think about that. My first email ever, because he heard of the internet. My dad, Puerto Rican carpenter, because he knew too, you'll love this, it would be affordable when I'm in Oxford that I don't have to, and I'd get the mail right away, right? He had a lot of incentives. He taught himself, he bought himself a computer, he did these things. This is a man, you know, in his late 40s, right? If my dad had had a Year Up, it didn't have to worry in scarcity mode, I can't even imagine. To me, he already did greatness, but I do believe talent is in every zip code, and we need to provide different opportunities to let that talent be real. I mean, America deserves to see the talent we have.
What was the most fun thing you did on President Obama's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for his family?
Work with you. If you don't know this, Dr. Fraga has a really kind of snarky sense of humor, and I so appreciate it because I think that's why I was like, oh, he's got edge and sarcasm. I love it. Okay, but also he's really brilliant as what I like. A real highlight, what made it fun for me, and I will say this, and if I would say this to you, is that when you said earlier that we really complemented each other well, we did. We both really respected each other and translated the language to highlight each other. We really did that. And let me tell you, to have a collegial relationship where there is just respect that drives it, and joint joy to see success, it's a wonderful feeling. And so I thank you for being a wonderful colleague for that. So that's one, that was a highlight. I think some of the other highlights were when Sotomayor, you know, I still get choked up. You know, I just the thought that she swore us in. People are like, oh, was it meeting Obama? I was like, being sworn in by Justice Sotomayor. That to me was probably one of those full circle moments in my life, and that my mom could be there and my family could be there. Like, it was just one of those moments where you pinch yourself and you go, I only wish my dad would have been there. He passed away the year before. And so, but it was one of those moments where I was just like, this is really powerful. And I had enormous, yes, I could say, I had enormous Puerto Rican pride too. There was just something, the nexus of what all of that meant was very powerful.
Great. Why did you decide to get your PhD?
You know, I decided to go for my doctorate because there were a couple of people that I worked with on the commission who were like, you are saying things that are really powerful on this commission, and the way to amplify your voice is by having these, it doesn't make you smarter, but it will amplify your voice. One of them was this gentleman right here to my left, who was like, enough. And was, it still is a mentor and a friend, but someone who said, because I would get frustrated, I'd be like, but they have a doctorate, that's an idea from 40 years ago, that's not inspiring. He'd look at me sarcastically and say, when are you going to do yours? So that it could be it, you know. And then also the chair of the commission at the time, which was Eduardo Padron from Miami-Dade College, who also said to me, the next time I see you, it better be with an application in your hand for your doctorate. Now, I didn't do traditional route. I mean, I did it later in life, but why I did it was because I had the question in my head. So I didn't have to do it. It was the research that drove me. And I really felt like all the experiences I had, particularly around how young adults thought about school and work and how they understood these decisions and the nexus of those decisions, that the literature didn't represent it. And I was really frustrated by that. And so, there you go. I decided to go and do
And it resulted in your first book.
It did. It resulted in the first book, and it resulted in articles, and I was grateful for it because I also realized that even research, even the way I asked the question, was a radical departure from traditional research. And that I count on all of you in this generation to really, destabilize some of these constraints around how we ask questions in research, that we ask them in a different way, that we think about them differently, because the academy needs it. I mean, when I started doing this work, literally the research said that if an African American student was working more than 6 hours a week, they would do terrible in school, in college. That was a documented research. First of all, that's racist and wrong, and I could say a whole bunch of other things. I don't care what you use. This is ridiculous, really. We know that that's not the case. And then I realized who's writing it, why are they writing it, what are the methods that they're using, and you know, that curious side of Lisette just said, do it. And then the last thing is, as a researcher, the number one question is, do you have access to the data? Can you do something that you could, you know? And I realized I had a level of access because my positionality to do it across states, and so that's how it happened.
Tell us about the Fund for the City of New York.
The Fund for the City of New York, and I am with my Vice President for Human Resources and Operations, Jill Barrero. Hi, Jill. Right there. Who hires all of our interns and all that, and she's fantastic. So just letting you all know, I'll talk to Jill. It's great. So the Fund for the City of New York has existed for 50 years. And the idea of the fund was that it would be this intermediary between government, the private sector, nonprofits. It would be this credible intermediary that would do things. One of the things would be that it would run one of the largest loan funds in the country for nonprofit organizations, particularly those that get money from the city and from the state. And so we're able to advance funds for small nonprofits, and that's important. The other thing is that we run what we call the Nobel Prize for Public Service. So we select 6 to 8 a year of people who dedicate their lives to public service out of the hundreds of thousands of public servants in New York. And we highlight them and some of the most inspiring stories. So when I'm drinking my water right here, I think of one of our recent honorees who, I think he got his GED, went to school at night, right? I mean, this incredible story, and who manages a clean water filtration plant of where I drink my water from. And if he didn't do this, he's first gen 2, if he didn't do it with the care and commitment that he had, we could be another Flint, Michigan, and we're not. So I think about people who dedicate themselves to do the work, that he could be an engineer in any other sector that he's in, so we do that. And then the other thing is we run an organization, a partner organization where, let's say anybody has an idea here and they'd like to run a nonprofit, but they realize there's a lot of complexity in running a nonprofit. It's a highly regulated industry in the United States, so we do all the back office operations, all the finance for it. And now we have 80 organizations there that include everything from changing the way we understand measurement and assessment so that it's much more inclusive, to looking at the question of peacekeeping in the city. The LGBTQ museum in New York that's going to be there in a few years, and you have to come because it's going to be extraordinary. We incubated. So there are all these things that that matter around what I consider, the fun helps people get out of the way to do their best work. That's what I see it as. So the partner organizations, the best leaders, just do that. We do the back office, and we love that we're supporting leaders that are making a difference, right? So that's what the fund is, and we also give grants, but we give them to our partner organizations. And though we are officially a nonprofit, we run very much like a foundation. But we also run in a very entrepreneurial way too, so we have a unique set of skill sets that are there. So what does that mean? We have some of the best finance people that work with us. That could be anywhere, but they choose to work with the fund because they know, oh my goodness, I'm not just doing bookkeeping, I'm also making sure that justice is a priority in Brooklyn, right? I'm just giving an example of that. So the fund is, but it also needs to reimagine itself. It's the first time it's being led by a person of color, a Latina, or anybody else, right? And I would say it is something that if you do not nurture, never assume that an institution stays cutting edge if it's not nurtured, if it's not constantly reinventing. And so I would say that is very much what the last 2 years of the fund has been for me, reimagining what this institution can do.
And you've been there how long? You said?
A year and a half,
A year and a
8
half?
months, yeah.
How long will you stay there?
Let me see. My VP walked out, so that's good. He asked the question when she walked out. I think I'm enjoying it right now. I don't like to put limits on that. I didn't sign a contract coming in. I've never signed a contract on anything, which is hard for people to imagine. I would expect to be there at least 5 years. I would. But I will tell you, I never think about it in terms of tenure. I think about it in terms of impact, right? Because I think that's a more important way of thinking about it. So when I said that number, it's because what do I expect? I expect to grow our volume of partner organizations by another 25%. Jill's going to have a heart attack when she hears that. I'd also love to see us build out a leadership center for public servants in a way that has not happened in a long time. I'd love to see that happen. And then we're incubating this small program that is about supporting local talent on community boards. And that is democracy at its most local and intimate level. And I believe that's where we need to put talent, because those decisions make a huge impact. And I would love to see that in every community board, and us be a model for the nation for that. So when you say, what's my tenure going to be? Those are my goals. How long do I think it will take to reach those goals? But I always have a new goal waiting. So that's the kind of impact that I'd like to see.
What do you see, how do you understand the difference between a transactional leader and a transformational leader?
Yeah. So a transactional leader is comfortable with someone who's just does the minimum to get by. As I say, is compliance oriented, right? So I would say that is someone who's, just get your job done, just move forward. A transformational leader is someone who's really interested in commitment. how do I get my team to commitment, not just compliance? It's a bit different. You could be compliant as a student. All of you could just be C's, between B's and C's. You could all get a good job afterwards. You'd be fine. You'll be fine. No one's really going to ask. Right? You could figure out. A committed student is something else. That is someone who sees learning as a priority, not just the grade, right? Transformational leaders get commitment out of people, not just compliance. That's a difference for me.
So what's next for Lisette Nieves? I know you've had opportunities and inquiries and so forth, and clearly the range of your talents is broad. You know, of course, running for office comes to mind.
Yeah,
having a senior level, a further senior level administrative appointment in the White House or in the governor's office, depending on whoever's governor of New York at the time that this would be considered. That's an insider New York joke that I'll laugh about.
Ideally, wow. You know what? Where I can make my greatest impact. I really say that because what I've had to accept for me is that not everybody has understood my professional choices. Because for me, it's not what's on the written page, it's what I see as the possible. I prefer opportunities where there is less written. If you're sending me a 20-page description, I have no interest in that opportunity. None. Because it gives me very little degrees of freedom to try something. So I like turnarounds. I took this job without a job description, though I knew about it. I mean, not surprised, just laughing at that, but it's actually the kind of thing that I enjoy. But I would say, so for me, it also has to be the right energy and the right people. You know what's so nice? Someone said this the other day, and I got it. I am at the stage in my life where I'm off resume. I really don't need another. Do I want it, right? Like, is it gonna, so for example, I'll give 2 examples. What if someone said, tomorrow, Lisette, you could be the head of a federal agency? That sounds good. That only matters if I'm able to bring at least 3 to 5 people with me. If I can't, then no, I'm not interested, right? I'm just giving you, and I'm not being disrespectful to that, but it's just at a point where I kind of can negotiate what does it need to have impact, and if I understand it's a collective, what's that mean? If someone said, tomorrow, Lisette, would you be the head of this institution, this higher ed institution? I know at some point I'd love to be the head of it. Has to be the right place. Has to be a place that accepts me for the non-traditional maverick that I am, but that really respects scholarship and academic at the same time, right? So it depends, right? Like, so, I'm sorry if that seems like a mushy response, but that's the way I kind of see these things. And I'd say the last thing of whatever my next thing is, I love when I can do a variety of things. The fund is perfect for me right now because I can do a variety of things that matter to me. I love a vertical learning curve. I love it. I love it. I love it. I live for it. I love being a very strong generalist. When you say to me, Lisette can do so many, because you don't understand, I'm like giddy. I'm like, I love that. That's exactly what I live for because I'm so curious. So for me, the opportunity is how much of all of me can I bring? How much talent can I cultivate there? And how much impact can I make? And that can come in so many different packages. And sometimes it's not even in the packages you think it's going to come in. So I leave myself really open to that. But if you see me go to something next, you better believe it's ticked off at least 2 of those 3. So.
Can we thank Lisette for her comments? Now questions from the audience.
You're going to be shy.
Oh, come on, you're not shy. I hear you in the lounge. Anybody?
I'm going to ask questions.
Go ahead.
How do you make
That's right.
I have questions.
how do you make your impact transferable like all across the country?
Oh, that's a good question. So, you know what? I don't start out thinking about impact as having national impact. So that's actually, I'm really glad you asked that question. I get excited by ideas here in a small space. And then when I see that that idea can be energized by others, that's what excites me. Because that's who's going to carry it national. It's not going to always be me that carries it national, right? So when we started with 10 young people and go to a few hundred and all these different firms, right? We start with one firm to the next. It wasn't that I said I want to have 50 firms at the end. But you know what? You realize that each time you start an idea and you get people who are champions, you could build something very powerful. So for me, I look at that. I test something by how many others get excited by it. And my team knows that already at the front. They know that. I could be excited, but if you're not jazzed, I know I can't move. I know I can't move. So I love it when they're more jazzed than I am about something. It's like, yes, this is the plan, right? So I say that because that's how it starts, right? That each of you are, I've been the seed for many other people in my life around ideas and inspiration, and I feel like that's what I look for with others. I think that's where it started.
Great question. Any questions better than Paula's? Of course, yes, Anya.
It's not going to be better than hers, but as leaders, how can we make sure that our impact is long-term on a community and not necessarily short-term?
Yeah. So one is, I think that's important, is to always make sure, and it's not easy. It's not easy. Learning how to facilitate is really important. So what do I mean by that? It's like, I think it's probably one of the best skills I learned early in life, and that's also went through training for it. So what does that mean? That means that you could really curate conversations where people feel like they're owning their ideas. You could help move people, right? It has to be more than you, because you're not going to always be there. I knew that about me early. You say, how are things going to last? Well, because I'm not going to be there forever. I'm not one of those people that stays at a place 20 years. I'm just not. That's just not who I am. And there's nothing wrong with that. But for me, that's just not the energy typically I have is in a certain part of an organization's tenure, right? So I would say who you bring to the table is important. How you understand shared power and how you share power is really important. And how patient you become with the process. Because sometimes some things have to sunset. Guess what? I may not have the best idea, but I tried it, and that could inspire someone else to tweak it and say, that's a better idea later. And I'm good with that too, because I had a role in the universe and getting us to that point. I may not be the end point. I never believe I'm that important that I'm going to be the greatest idea, right? But if I could walk away saying this community is more energized than it's been, this community has a voice in a way it hadn't had before, this community's come together and they know each other, that they can be powerful together, then to me that is very successful. So I say the tenets of, or the spirit or the philosophy of what it means for a community to own its power is where I would focus my energy than what is the activity. Because we get focused on the activity, and I actually think that could become a distraction. When the truth is, just getting people to the table, that's the radical notion, right? That's what scares people, right? So that's it.
Another question. Yes.
What's the most surprising thing you've learned about working in the nonprofit sector?
That I think people underestimate how competitive it is as well too. The nonprofits are as diverse as the for-profit companies are, and there are those that are some are best in class and some that are terrible. And they all have to compete for talent. And so what I know is that you have to, for the best, and as someone who's had to hire and build a nonprofit, if talent is your priority, you have the power to set up the structure to make sure that talent is attracted to you. So, and I think that's something that you have to be very intentional about. So I think sometimes people feel like, oh, it's a nonprofit, you could get that job anywhere. And then when they realize how hard it is to get the job, they're like, why is it that hard? It's like, There's a whole generation of people who want to lead with their heads and their hearts together. Why do we have to trade those off? There are a bunch of brilliant people who might not get excited about widgets. Some do. But some want to, and I just say that. And then the other part is that people are constantly reimagining things about nonprofits. That's where there's a lot of entrepreneurship happening. That could be the Doña Juana who decides tomorrow, I'm going to sit and start up a new charter school with this other teacher because no one is really doing language immersion the way that they should. Or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that, right? So this idea of that kind of entrepreneurship that has this community impact is in the nonprofit sector. And I think at times, sometimes I underestimated that. But not with our partnership organization, because I see it every day. When I get to see what they're doing, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm in the right place. Right?
Yes, Natalie.
So how do you know when to step back from a project or kind of when to move on from a new, like to a new opportunity? Because I mean, I feel like there's endless ways for you to like use your time and your talent.
Yeah.
So how do you like discern all those different opportunities?
That is actually a great question, and sometimes that's more art than science, right? I typically try not to leave a place. Okay, there's two answers to that. Okay, there's two answers. You know, I used to travel a lot for work, and I still travel, but I used to travel a lot more for work. And you read these airplane magazines, and I read a quote in this airplane magazine. Someone wrote the questions like a Dear Abby section. Oh, can you help me with this professional question? So one was, when is the right time to leave for your dream job? Right? And the response was, yesterday. And the reason why I say that is that if it's your dream job, I thought this was interesting, if it's truly your dream job, nothing else matters. Because how many people get to live out their dreams? Right? So it was a really powerful moment for me. I read that, I was like, oh, you know, so there's a part of me that feels like if it's the dream, but then I realized my dream is a little bit more complicated. It's not one, when Dr. Fraga was asking me what's next, when I told him this, the nexus between these three things, impact, talent, position, right? Right? Scale of impact, talent, bringing talent and position. You don't know how that's going to come together. So I think of a few things. I think about where I am, what time in my life, that's changed by decade. So early in my career, I could leave things sooner. I always say that's actually the last time you should play it conservative. You actually have more freedom than you think to walk away from your first job than you ever imagined. In fact, some people stay stuck and they don't have to. People don't even remember sometimes. I just say that so that sometimes, I think the later you go, you have to think about reputation, you have to think about relationships, you have to think about connections to people and those types of things. I've been able to leave jobs always at a moment where I always leave a job. Someone asked me this question. I always leave a job when I know I still love it, but before I dislike it. Does that make sense? Because that's really important for me, because what is the energy that I have? I never leave a job saying, good Lord, I hated that. I don't do that. And some of that is because I don't ever feel the push. I'm always fighting the pull. And some people wait for the push. You have to decide what kind of person you are. I'm always sorting through the pull. So, and that's where you learn. When Dr. Fraga in his leadership course asks that question, you know, when he says, look at your own leadership, learn things about yourself. What does it mean, right? You learn over time in the career, what does loyalty mean? What does commitment mean to someone? What's realistic, what's not? There's gonna be trial and error with that, right? So, I don't know if that helped you too much, but it's a complicated one, right? It's a complicated one. It's complicated, and I would say, as a Latina, that I always feel like people are looking at what you do. I have invisibility when I don't want invisibility. And then I have visibility when I'd like a little invisibility, right? And so for me, I always have to think about how does that look broader, but I don't see that always as a burden. I kind of see that at this point in my life, that's okay. That's why bringing people along is important for me, right? So, take risks early in the career.
One of you worked for the Fund for the City of New York this past summer.
Yes.
What was that like?
It was definitely something different from what I expected, in the sense that I had never heard of a foundation or like a nonprofit organization
Mhm.
that helped other nonprofits
That's right.
with their bookkeeping and technical issues. So that was something very new to me that I hadn't thought about before, and I thought that was like very eye-opening in that sense. The amount of organizations that are in New York, that was outstanding. I was like, oh my gosh, there's about any kind of organization for everything that there is.
Mhm.
And I thought that was very impactful. I remember I believe I interviewed one person from the SMART
Mhm.
organization, and she was talking to me about how important that organization was to her, and how inspired she was to create this organization to help other people, and even during the pandemic, being able to provide these services to the people that needed it. Just as a quick context, SMART is an organization that works on helping people with, I believe it's AIDS, right?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
HIV/AIDS, HIV positive to AIDS, yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. And was founded by people, Latino women who had HIV and AIDS, who said they need to see the face of us as helping each other, not as victims.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's existed, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, I was very inspired by that. And how like during COVID they still kept up with their like using Facebook Live and helping people with their tablets, and like especially people that didn't know how to use them, and then like doing their courses. So I just found that very inspirational. I was very sad of not being in there in person and like seeing everything, but I found that very, very inspirational. Yeah.
We were lucky to have you.
I was very lucky to be able part of your organizations that summer. I really appreciate it.
Luis, you had a question?
Paloma.
No, Paloma had a question, sorry.
Yeah, I often hear from the young women on this campus that they rarely run into professional women. And some of the questions that come up are, how do you decide when to get married, when to have kids, and make all your career decisions?
Oh, the easy, this was an easy question, right?
What advice do you have for this generation of young women?
Wow, okay.
And then?
Yeah, I would say, one thing I learned about myself early on, that I was not gonna have a traditional marriage. I had to accept that. And what do I mean by that? My dad was phenomenal, and he was a hands-on dad, but to the goals that I had, I needed a partner in a way that was gonna step up in a different, I'm just being honest, and that was important for me, because I knew I wanted to be a mom, but I didn't know if I wanted to be in a traditional marriage that I saw all these other Puerto Rican relationships. I was like, ay Dios mío, these women work hard, and they gotta do all this. No, I'm joking and I'm not joking. Does that make sense? There was this stress that I was feeling around what are the social cultural gender constraints, but then also having my unapologetically, but at that time it was apologetic, ambition. Right? And so how was I going to balance those two? Right? Because I enjoyed conversations, in my case, cisgender, heterosexual, right? And I enjoyed conversations with men, very intellectual conversations. I wanted to be a peer to them. I did not want to play beta. I'm just saying that was not me. And that may not have been always the narrative that they expected from Latinas. And so I just kind of accepted that I was always going to be a little bit different. And that, accepting that difference gave me freedom to try things. So I did find a partner, a wonderful partner, as you've met him, Greg, who we are a dual career couple. And But he also, what I would say, he's not Puerto Rican, he's African American, and I say that, just happens to be in that case. And what was important about that relationship was that he was as invested in me and my goals. And that was huge. Not just my goals of being a mom, being his wife, being his partner, but in what my goals were. He kind of also said there was no way that I was not going to tolerate him if he didn't. But I just, I joke about that. But that was a big part, is that I learned that, and even with a full partner, the sociocultural gender expectations are hard. It's a lot. I'm expected to do certain things as a daughter of a Latina, and a Latina. So when I put off having children for the first 5 years of marriage, because I was in grad school and doing all these different things, and I really felt, it's so funny, I was like, oh, we can't afford children. Meanwhile, I never stopped any of my family, right? Like this notion, and it was funny how it was like, wow, like already going to college changed my expectations of when I could have children, right? Even just that question, right? And then when I wanted to have children, it wasn't so easy for me to have children. And so I struggled for quite a few years to have children. And then I was able to have a child, and it worked out. But I say that because I think people aren't open and honest about when they've struggled, when just because you think, oh, because, at tiempo, right now, we're done. No, it doesn't work like that. So I went through a moment of, did I miss a window? Is this, I had a little bit of that kind of, and I'm glad I didn't miss a window. But I realized there isn't a perfect time to have a child, but there are some better times than others, if that makes sense. And I'm just grateful I get to do it with a partner. Right? I really am. I really am. I will tell you this, I have other professional friends of mine that do not have partners and have chosen to be single moms and have chosen to have children on their own. And wow, that's hard, but I've seen that decision. And because I look at them, and that probably would have been me if I didn't find a partner. Like I said, I saw myself as a mom. I didn't see myself as married. That was already radical, right? I didn't tell my dad that. So, but for me, right? So what do I say to young people? I say there's time. There are a lot more role models that have children, not just in their 20s, later, and that, I just say that because I think that's important. Sometimes we don't. And then the other part is too, like anything else, if you want it in your life, then you have to prioritize it in your life. And that just means that there are some trade-offs, right? And trade-offs look differently if you do it alone versus if you do it with someone else. But there are trade-offs. So I don't regret it. I'm grateful for being a mom. But I also don't regret or feel guilty about getting joy from my professional career. I have no regret over that. Because that feeds me too. Right? Because there's this narrative, well, you're going to die old if you don't have children and be No, I've met other people who aren't so miserable. They're okay. They're too. But I say that because what fulfills you. And then the last thing I'll end on that is I had my child, my son, and by the 3rd month I knew I was going back to work. Some people are like, oh, I'm going to stay home. And I know that I have other type A friends that they become the best homeschooling parents. I don't know, they like transform. Like they were running Goldman Sachs and then the next thing I know, they're home building a school. I don't even... Month 3, even my husband was like, please go back to work. And it was just because I was fulfilled as a mom too, but I'm in and of the world too. There were other parts of me. And I'm glad I had a partner where there was no guilt around that. Because that's important too. So I love that I don't have to apologize for that.
Great. Beautiful answer. Rocio? And then the gentleman over there.
First of all, thank you for coming up I drove in from Chicago because I was like, I have to see
Oh,
her. I want to say hello. My
It's good
question to
seeing
you,
you.
yeah, good to see you as well. My question to you is, what are you still working on today in terms of personal growth? And then twofold, how would you like your legacy to be described? I mean, you've done so much, but how would you like your legacy to be described?
So personal growth is, it took me a little too long to be unapologetic about doing things for myself, time for myself. I wish I would have done that a little bit earlier. I just felt like one more thing could be put on the schedule. Remember when I talked about trade-offs? Actually, now I'm like, well, that means that doesn't get done. And I'm more intentional. I could, you know, there was that old expression where if the mom is, and I've seen this with my mom, she's making toast for everyone, but one of the toasts that comes out a little bit burnt, she's gonna have the burnt toast, right? Right? We know, right? This is a metaphor for so much the way women will say, oh, nobody else has, nobody, then I was starting to, nobody notices I'm eating the burnt toast here, right? Everybody else, right? I joke about it, but I'm not joking in the sense of right now, I feel like I have to say to myself, especially after the pandemic and everything else, what is going to feed me? And it doesn't have to always involve the tribe. Because we are a Bahranda, Puerto Ricans, they all come together. And I was like, you know what, no, I realize Lisette actually likes to be alone for 48 hours. And that, now I do it unapologetically. I may do that twice a year where I just say, I love you, that's how I take care of myself. And even if it's just to read or to write, or, and it sounds like doesn't sound like a big deal, but it's a big deal. Because my mother's idoneta, yeah, I still get shade. You know what I mean? They don't understand me all the time. And what I realize is that you don't have to understand someone to still respect them, right? And so for me, creating that boundary where I do things for me is an important part of my self-care. Because I have been the safety net. I have taken care of others. And it was very easy for me to almost care more about them than sometimes them themselves. That's not a good thing. So, yeah. So lesson to all of you, don't wait till you're into your 50s to do that. You could do that earlier. Paloma shaking her head, she gets it, yeah. My legacy, that very much, that is through others. That there's a whole group of change makers out there who feel like Lisette was the one that helped mentor them and support them, right? Like really, that is to me, that's the legacy, right? And that they keep doing it to others too, right? Like that is what I feel so strong about. I feel so strong about that. Yeah, that's the legacy. That's it. People say, how do you live on? Again, through others. People who were doing that, right? Like I talk about Dr. Fraga, but I will tell you one thing. I love meeting all his students who are now in all these different policy positions, and they're all like in a club together. They call it, you know, what do they call themselves? The fragistas.
Fragalistas.
The fragalistas, right? So you talk about this issue of legacy. It really is this idea of, you know, if I play a role in helping people get out of their way to be their best selves, I have won. Because that's what's changing this country. That's what's changing this world. So, that's my legacy.
Anyone else? Yes, in the back, I'm sorry.
All right. With nonprofits been a very community-focused field, how has some of the nonprofits you've been part of and helped create it ingratiated themselves in like the different communities that y'all operate in, outside of just providing them opportunities to grow?
Oh, that's great.
And could you possibly share any examples?
Sure, that's great, that's great. Though there's two ways of thinking about, right? Because you could have, we all know that too, someone could come in and say, I'm serving the community and never hire anyone from the community, right? Never do any, they don't live in the community and stuff like that. I've always hired people locally, that's important, right? So that's for Europe, that was super important, right? I also felt too it was important for folks to see images on themselves in a variety of roles across the hierarchy. So at Europe, we knew we weren't getting enough African American men to be our IT instructors. So I created a fellowship because I knew they were there. I knew they were there. right? Like I said, it's not a pipeline problem, it's a recruitment problem. If we always call it a pipeline problem, recruiters will never change, because they could say it's that. So if I know, even now at the fund, we get turnover in a certain area, we don't have enough here, we're creating a fellowship. And we're gonna make it prestigious, and it's gonna pay well, and guess what? Until we exhaust our recruitment efforts, then we're gonna call it a pipeline problem, but we haven't begun to exhaust. So for me, and maybe that's because early in my career I stumbled into being a recruiter, and I got that. I got that really, because I was like, whoa, this is not a pipeline problem, right? So I would say that's one of the first things, is that you could have someone from outside of your community build something. See, I was from New York, so I always felt part of New York. But I've also done things outside of New York where I've been the outsider, right? And so, what does it mean to build credibility and relationships with communities? And those are examples where when I talked about facilitation, it's really important, right? Many of you are going to build something here at Notre Dame, but guess what? How many of you were born within a few blocks of you? Probably none of you, right? Guess what? You're an outsider to these communities, even if you feel connected, right? So even that, maybe by education, you're the outsider. You may feel connected with it, you're the one at college, they're not, right? I'm just saying, right? So how do you overcome all those things? And that's through building and being transparent about what the goals are, what you're trying to do. And being flexible with those goals to allow people to see themselves as part of that, right? So that's what I think is super important. And I did quite a bit of that year. When I think about the fund, I always think about recruitment on that. This is why we have our VP with us here on this visit too, because she knows talent is everywhere. She's gonna go where talent is. And she's gonna talk about the fund, and we're gonna get the best talent we have. And we know Notre Dame has excellent talent. Do you not, right? Yes, right? So, that's, you have to be willing to build those relationships of credibility. What I will say to you is, building credibility is not on your timeline. It's on their timeline. They tell you when you're credible. You don't tell yourself when you're credible. That's what makes it so scary, is that you could say, I've gone through so many meetings with this group. You know why? Because some of our communities are so used to being lied to. And when you're dealing with a community that has been lied to in every language imaginable, you got to work harder to build that trust. As a good friend of mine says, you can't microwave trust. Right? So you want to think about that when you're building something. And that's how, and they'll tell you. Oh, they'll tell you. If you work with a Latino community, they'll tell you quickly if it's working or not. They'll tell you. If you have even trust for them to tell you. Right? So did that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you.
Anyone else? We're just about at the end of our time. Let's thank Dr. Nieves one more time. Most importantly of all of Lisette's accomplishments is that she serves on the advisory council for the Institute for Latino Studies. So she's here in the fall at a home football game.
Oh, yeah. My first football game ever was at Notre Dame.
She had never been to a football game before. Can you imagine that? No.
I know you can, but basketball, even boxing, but never.
But we'll have her back for more talks. I think she has incredible power to help us see the power in ourselves and the power in our communities. So Lisette, thank you. We can't wait for the next time you're here.
Thank you, Dr. Clark.